to a wider audience. There it goes. So feel free to make your comments as broadly applicable as you feel is suited. Thank you.
Thank you. So one of the things that when you're talking about climate finance is lots of numbers get thrown around. And I thought, depending on where people are joining this conversation, it might be useful to kind of lay out some categories as you're thinking, especially for those of you in local communities or city governments, the kinds of costs and finance issues that you maybe want to think about. So that's what I'm going to do today, just kind of quickly sketch out very high level, some big categories that may or may not be useful to you as you start thinking through more in depth your own municipalities and the kind of finance needs you may need to be thinking about. So the first big question is, how much finance do we need? And to do that, we have to have some categories. So let's start first with the kind of the ones that people think of first, which are sort of these direct costs of either climate action, like mitigation actions, or climate change. So let's think about those as two categories. On one hand, you need things like investments in renewable energy, energy efficiency, retiring old infrastructure, the actual kind of investments that are going to be needed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. This is a direct cost for municipalities and actually all level of government. Some of these are going to save money, and so thinking of them as only a cost is kind of an artificial way of thinking about this. The trick here, though, when you look at how well they have rolled out, is that many of the barriers are kind of hidden barriers. So for instance, classic example is energy efficiency investments would save tons of money and tons of emissions, and yet often landlords don't want to put the money into this because it's not their money, their renters are going to pay the bills, and so it's really no business on their end. What this does is it means you end up with a bunch of buildings that aren't energy efficient, low-income people who are renting them end up bearing the costs, and you miss a lot of emissions. And so issues like this, where you have mismatching of who's bearing which signals in the market, is a really common problem when we're talking about things that could be done which would save emissions and often would save money, but they're not always being done because of who's bearing which costs. So that's something to think about for any of those kinds of bundles of costs. The other big direct cost, of course, is the actual cost from climate change, right? So here are the things we need to do to protect ourselves from climate change or deal with the impacts afterwards. So this could include everything from like fixing roads or infrastructure that's been damaged. So imagine, I know in our area, ice dams are a big issue. It's an area that's something that's going to be happening increasingly across Ontario, for those of you who are in Ontario. Other areas are facing other kinds of immediate losses from climate, whether that's increased storm activity, it could be increased flooding, could be things like crop losses. All of those kinds of issues are immediate adaptation issues. And you can also think about things you might want to do to protect people in the future, like retrofitting your houses or businesses, or retrofitting, municipal buildings so that they're more comfortable and more climate resilient. So these are the kinds of costs that people usually think about when they think about climate change, right? How much does it cost to try to act on climate change, and how much is it going to cost us to adapt to climate change? But this is unfortunately only the tip of the iceberg. There are also whole categories of indirect costs. And so here are the things that might not first cross your mind, but actually can be very substantial. So things like increased public health costs due to changes in disease vectors, so I spend a lot of time in Arizona, I'm a professor there. We see huge increases in bills for hospitals, which are borne by usually the state or the county, because of people undergoing heat stress who do not have health insurance. That puts an indirect, very high cost on the public sector. And they may not necessarily be included in when people are first costing out the cost of climate change. But if you take an integrated look at costs, you see that these can be very, very large. You also would have things like changes in employment or costs to industries that depend on other industries. So for instance, as snowpack changes in the Blue Mountains area, what will that do to the skiing industry? What does that do to all of the industries locally that depend on that income? You're going to have all kinds of knock-on effects in terms of changes in large industries in particular areas. So even if something initially doesn't look like it's climate sensitive, you have to think about how all those costs might ripple through whole regions. And one of the big ones is changes in insurance. And so the insurance industry has taken a real beating. They've been one of the industries that's been most carefully following climate change because, of course, they're on the hook for all kinds of climate losses. They're going to be changing premiums. There's major changes happening in insurance industries all over the place. And those are kind of costs that municipalities may not have thought about. You may not be factoring in long-term changes in premiums or thinking about what is or is not going to be insurable in the future. And that can really leave, especially municipalities, out to hang to dry if they haven't thought through those in advance. And then there's also, of course, costs that get absorbed by actors, which are not factored into public finance, but have real implications. So this is either losses that people absorb in their families or in their businesses, which they do not recoup and are not necessarily tracked by public finance. Again, that can have really big implications in public well-being, and it can have larger ripple effects on the regional level, but they're not always included in the estimates of climate finance costs. This doesn't even cover, of course, the non-economic loss and damage, which is a whole other category of things like, what are you going to do about mental health losses as people face grief from climate change or displacements? Who bears those costs and how are you going to deal with them? There's a whole, that's a whole can of worms that we could get into. One thing I do want to bring up here, especially for those of you in municipal level government, is thinking about risk. So again, this takes us back to the insurance industries and an area where local governments may or may not be thinking about this, is thinking about the uncertainty of climate futures means that we cannot rely on business as usual predictions in terms of thinking about costs, what things will cost, the kinds of impacts they're going to be facing. So there's lots of research out there about how to model for uncertain futures using multiple scenarios, for example. And these are some things that municipalities may want to start thinking about doing as they're thinking about how to even wrap their head around the ways in which climate change is going to affect municipal budgeting. Now, I want to just make one last comment. I have no idea where I am from time, but I'm assuming I'm running out, is one last comment that may not seem relevant for those of you at the local government focus, but it is the issue internationally, which is supply of climate finance internationally. So estimates internationally, the Standing Committee on Finance in the UNFCCC is estimating somewhere between 5.8 and 5.9 trillion US dollars annually by 2030. That money has to come from somewhere. Now you might say, why does this matter to Canadians? The fact is, without transferring very large amounts of finance to the global south, those economies are not going to be able to transform in order to have adequate mitigation. This may seem like development rather than climate change, but let me assure you, this is essential for global climate action. We have to transfer money to the global south, or we are not going to get the kind of climate action, which then means municipalities in the global north are going to be hit even harder because we are going to miss our targets. So this is a very serious public finance issue, which does not get enough attention in Canadian society because we have to figure out how we're going to come up with finance to transfer internationally. Otherwise, we're simply not going to be able to protect ourselves. And with that, I will hand it on to the next speaker.
Sonia, thank you so much. Some really great notes in there about some of the other financial impacts that are often not thought about. And I have been taking prodigious notes here for my report back to the UEF team. So I'm going to keep us moving along. So next up, I have Ezgi Kanpolat, who is the Social Development Specialist with World Bank's Climate Change Group, Climate Investment Funds. And I'm just going to make sure, oh, yep, there you are. So I will go ahead and hand it over to you. And again, I don't know what time zone you're in today, but I have 9:26 a.m. So over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for the invitation. It's great to be part of the Urban Economy Forum's another event. So this is my second event with the Urban Economy Forum. So just to follow up Sonia's remarks, I think the climate finance, international climate finance question is a big part of the puzzle in terms of how we are going to address climate crisis. So I just want to touch upon in my remarks what the climate investment funds is doing to address this question of climate finance. So climate investment fund, and we have over 8 billion commitments from our donors. Abbreviation is CIF, aims to support low carbon transitions through climate mitigation and adaptation investments, including supporting green and inclusive recovery. A huge focus on just transition and ensuring that these key contexts in different sectors are happening in a way that is just, inclusive, and fair. So in that context, we work with our implementing partners. So CIF directly works with multilateral development banks, MDBs, that are implementing, raising co-financing through their own financial instruments. And in certain contexts, we are also raising private sector financing. So what you have is essentially a kind of through concessional financing, unlocking of other forms of financing that comes together in a way that is not possible if you were to not have concessional financing. So our goal is to ensure that we kind of lower the costs of these key sector transitions, and we make it attractive formational interventions through our partners. In the context of urbanization, we have a focus on climate smart city. You know, we kind of have a investing program that is focusing on supporting cities, and in our kind of it is a program that we recently finalized that is not launched yet, but we have been supporting addressing climate change risks and impacts in cities through our resilience program, through our clean technology program. So we had a focus on cities for a while, since CIF was established around 2008. And now we want to take that focus and have a much more concentrated approach to climate cities, to basically support climate smart cities. And this program has been designed, but it is right now at a process where we haven't launched the program yet. Meanwhile, CIF launched other programs, including a coal transition program, which has really attracted a lot of fun. Under that coal transition program, CIF is supporting Asia, India, as well as Philippines. So under our, we are talking about energy efficiency investments in urban buildings, such as in countries like Turkey. We have a lot of sustainable transport projects that we are supporting. We also, of course, have a huge focus on disaster risk management and improving resilience to disaster risks in urban contexts through our resilience program. So among all these projects that we are supporting, again, they're implemented by our implementing partners, MDBs, we have a focus on ensuring that these investments are gender responsive and inclusive. So what do I mean by that? For instance, we know in the context of cities, during COVID, we know that women's jobs have been particularly vulnerable, as they have been working in retail and hospitality sectors. We also know that their access to social protection measures was different than men, and they need particular needs. We also know in the context of disasters, for instance, people with disabilities, they have particular needs. They can be left out of both disaster risk response and early warning, for instance, interventions. So overall, our approach aims to address climate crisis in a way that is inclusive and gender responsive. And I just want to mention, for instance, some of our gender responsive design of some of our projects. For instance, in the context of sustainable transport investments. We supported Metro Manila bus rapid transit projects in Philippines, which is aiming to improve the sustainability of public transport system in Manila. And we ensured that this project consulted extensively with women at the project design phase, and that included their particular needs in the design of the transport system. And we also ensured that women can have access to employment opportunities that will be created during this project. In the area of energy, use of off-grid solar installation, improving energy efficiency in urban context. For instance, we know that there's a huge opportunity there in terms of creation of green jobs, but who will have access to these jobs is an entirely different question. And there we have significant inequalities with respect to women's lack of representation in STEM-related educational fields. They are already lack of representation in engineering fields. So they do not, if we do not really design particular interventions to address their skills needs and other needs, they will not be able to equally take advantage of these green employment opportunities. So we are supporting, for instance, working with our partners again to address this gap in terms of women's renewable energy employment. And there are a lot of dimensions to that. Again, it starts at the schools. It starts at encouraging women to pursue those STEM-related education field, addressing stereotypes around it, and then we look at school to work transition, and then within the workplace we talk about women's career advancement and supporting women through other measures. For us, our interventions then are interventions that not only address climate change, but also we acknowledge that we can address both gender equality, social inclusion, and climate change together, and not in an ad hoc way, but we know that these gains are all supportive of each other. For instance, we cannot really let half the population to basically be left out of the new green economy that we are trying to create. It doesn't make sense in terms of deployment of human capital. So again, we are really kind of weaving through these goals together, and that's our approach across our investments. So I will stop here. But I'm happy to elaborate more during our discussion in any particular area, particularly the programs we have, and provide more information. But I just want to kind of highlight, and these are the discussions that the World Bank is having, MDBs are having. We really need concessional financing, and without concessional financing, it's very hard in developing countries, particularly, to pursue these investments, pursue these transformations in different sectors. We need to make it attractive, and that's what exactly CIF has been doing. So we need more concessional financing resources in supporting our developing countries in their own green and resilient economic development. Thank you.
Eski, thank you so much. Really great to hear about the climate investment funds programs, and twice now we're 2 out of 2 with our speakers who have emphasized the importance of a just transition and an inclusive transition. So thank you for bringing that back to mind. I'll continue to move along. We have Angel Cardenas Sosa, Director of Infrastructure Projects at the South Region of CIF, Development Bank of Latin America. And I will just keep things moving along. And oh, there you are. And Angel, I'll hand it over to you. So if you could just check the time where you are right there, and note 5 minutes from now. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you. And I think I'm 1 hour behind you guys, and it's really an honor. Since I was a former Torontonian, I lived there for a couple of years. It's really nice to be in that area. So I'm probably just going to follow up on what my predecessors mentioned, because CAF as a multilateral development bank also stresses the point of finding more international financing, and especially concessional financing. And we do this basically based on our diagnosis. We are a regional bank, so we cover most of Latin America. And what we see is that cities need more sustainable infrastructure in order to achieve their climate goals. I mean, that is a fact, but cities in developing countries are struggling even more to deliver that sustainable infrastructure. And this is worse right after the pandemic. It was already difficult before, but after the pandemic, even the fiscal spaces that cities or municipality or state levels governments have, it's more difficult. So I think the big call to action here is how we find more finance for adaptation infrastructure, and how can we make sure to catalyze that and to bring that together to the table. CAF has made a bold decision last year based on the equity increase of $7 billion that our board members of our country members authorized. We determined that we are going to move from being 23% of our green portfolio to 40% in the next 5 years. That basically means $25 billion of new approvals in green projects. And those projects are mainly going to be directed or targeted in cities. But it's easy to say than to do it. So how do you do it? Because when you face and when you encounter, and this is something that happens in Latin America, the local governments don't necessarily have the capabilities to deploy that infrastructure. So for that reason, we've been working with different cities, intermediate cities, large cities, and municipalities in order to strengthen their capabilities to invest in. And in doing so, we've been building kind of a virtuous circle, and where it's easier for us to channel green financing or third-party financing, concessional financing into this project. We're still making this, we're still doing like baby steps, but we do believe we need to scale these initiatives. Because I mean, the problem is not only the funding, but it's also the good projects that our counterparts don't have. So we are developing with other partners an incubator of green projects, and hopefully we'll be showcasing that to different cities. And that would be definitely the main entrance for us to access to more financing. We're also partnering up with different entities such as subnational and national development banks in countries. I mean, this is a territory that hasn't been really explored in the past, but more than ever, we're seeing that these national or subnational development banks are interested in financing this type of projects, but they don't necessarily know how to do so. So we're partnering up with them and looking for ways to de-risking the projects, and more importantly, developing methodologies that could help them to achieve these infrastructure goals. It is definitely a process that takes time, because again, depending on which country you are or what counterpart you have, you will see more or less technical capability. But we believe our mission is there in the communities, and to build that strength that hopefully will make them more appealing to actually catalyze more resources. And of course, we're working on different technical cooperation solutions. We've been, since 2018, we've been developing vulnerability index, climate vulnerability index in different cities that have provided sort of a roadmap in many countries on what type of infrastructure need you have and how to implement it, and what's the roadmap to do so. We believe that is a tool that could be used in many other countries and many other cities. So mayors and governors, because I mean, we're thinking about more subnational entities, not necessarily cities, will have better information to make better decisions. But then again, the big problem is you need to match an ample offer or supply of resources with good projects. And believe it or not, good projects are not necessarily easy to find. So we're working again also with feasibility investment facilities that hopefully will help them, cities and local governments, in developing a good pipeline of projects. So I'm probably going to stop here, and I'm more than happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Angel, thank you so much. And this is a really important point that you've touched on with local governments. Quite often, capacity and technical capabilities are lacking. So it will be very interesting to further that conversation. I'm going to keep moving just because I'm watching the time, but we will come back to questions if we have any. Linda Swanson, and just want to make sure, Linda, yep, there you are. It's in the room. She's the relatively newly minted manager of climate change initiatives in Grey County, which is a geographic area sort of northwest of Toronto, since we continue to orient ourselves to Toronto here today. And looking forward to having you present today. So I'll turn it over to you, Linda. Thank you.
Thank you, Derek. And I think it's actually a really nice arc of the speakers, because I very much can speak to that local level experience that Angel, you just referenced in terms of that internal capacity, and some of the kind of framing, Sonia, that you set up at the beginning definitely resonates in my experience. So as Derek mentioned, I'm relatively new to Grey County. I actually live just along the bay from Collingwood in a town called Owen Sound on the traditional territory of the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation. And I do just like to reference kind of the traditional territory that I'm on, because I think especially in conversations like this that are talking not just about climate, but also equity and justice and development, recognizing wherever we are, the kind of relationships that we have or should have with the Indigenous peoples and the traditional keepers of our land, I feel is really important. I used to live and work in the city of Toronto until about a year ago. I worked for the city as their manager of research and policy and climate change. And I think, you know, one of the things that's been really eye-opening in moving to Grey County, which is a much, much smaller jurisdiction of about 100,000 people total, from City of Toronto, which was about 3 million, is when I worked for the City of Toronto, I certainly felt, you know, resource strapped and capacity constrained in terms of what we were able to deliver on the climate file. And moving to such a more rural and smaller jurisdiction, I see that, you know, that those issues certainly persist, and if anything, I think are escalated in sort of smaller rural environments. So the question of climate financing for me on a day-to-day basis has, I guess, kind of two facets. One is how would we as the Grey County municipality pay for the interventions that we need to make in our own infrastructure? So those kind of direct costs that Sonia referenced. And then the second is, what role do we as Grey County, a municipality, have to play in catalyzing financing for the community-wide transformations that are needed? So is there a role for us? And I feel yes, to try and help money and resources flow across our community for those kind of retrofit programs for homeowners or business owners. So one of the things that often I get asked is, how much will this cost? You know, what will the cost of adapting or mitigating climate change be? And again, just to give a local example, for the City of Toronto, their most recent estimates, so they released an updated kind of costing estimate for their climate action plan called Transform TO, that between now and 2050, the incremental capital investment would be $145 billion in terms of community-wide investment. So obviously that's a big ticket number. We don't have that number for Grey County. Again, even calculating those kind of cost numbers is a significant endeavor. And so for Grey County, what we've chosen to do is sort of cost out project by project. But I think similarly, what you see is these are numbers that make people pause. They're not things where it feels necessarily, oh, we can just easily absorb this into our existing budgets. In terms of the financing assets, sort of, I guess, for those municipal infrastructure or financing approaches for municipal infrastructure, I think one thing I'd like to highlight is the amount of effort that is asked of municipalities to access some of those finances. So Angel, you spoke about whether or not there's kind of capacity to deliver climate projects in some of the local municipalities that you work with. And certainly I think, there's no question, and I'm sure Patrick will speak to this, about the need for transparency and accountability when funding flows to local municipalities. I'd also, I guess, just offer for consideration, what is the amount of time and effort being asked of municipal staff to access and report on funding, because it can in and of itself become quite a burden. For larger municipalities, we'll look at things like green bonds. The City of Toronto, the City of Ottawa have both issued green bonds to finance the climate capital projects. That's beyond the scope of a lot of smaller municipalities. Similarly, there's a lot of talk even in, I guess, the global north about trying to access private capital. Derek, you'd mentioned sort of how co-ops will sometimes, play a role in financing. There's certainly examples. The region of Durham has used a co-op to finance their home energy retrofit program. So a financing approach that's often used is something called the local improvement charge, where a homeowner is able to take out a loan from the municipal government at a concessional financing rate, that's a new term for me today, to be able to borrow that money at below the cost of borrowing they would have from a bank, but coming directly from the municipality. But I think, there's certainly examples where private capital is coming in to fill that role as well. And the third and most frequent approach that often municipalities use, beyond just using their actual tax base, is funding through application. So right now, Grey County has, I guess, a couple of applications in different stages with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities Green Municipal Fund, which is a big funder in Canada for municipal climate action. And, I think it's an amazing resource to have. There's lots of different funding streams. There's certainly, I think, one of the benefits is that those dollars also come with capacity building support, which is something that municipalities really appreciate. But I guess, without laboring on it too much, sometimes the reporting requirements associated with those application-based funding opportunities are something that we consider when we're looking at where we might try to seek climate financing. And maybe I'll end just on the point that there's a stat used in Canada, and I don't know if it translates globally, that we're often told that municipalities have control over 50% of really sort of climate decisions, that the things that impact our global emissions, 50% of them are within municipal control. And I like to tweak that always and say that 50% of them are within municipal influence, because I think it's sometimes a bit of a stretch to suggest that a level of government that has the most restricted taxation powers and the most restrictive regulatory powers because of the frameworks we operate in under other orders of government has that level of control. But I think what we are is a really excellent partner to work with, in Canada, provincial or federal government levels to implement. But that implementation really needs to be a coordinated, multi-scalar approach that empowers local municipalities to take action, hopefully without creating too much of an undue burden around reporting or application. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Linda, and absolutely terrific local context that I think is very key to this conversation today. Also, it's a bit of a, I guess, as we say, it's a small world because the credit union co-op that funded or funds the region of Durham's energy retrofits, that is Pathways Credit Union, the one where I am the current board chair. So. Small world. I will, and whoever put together the order of presenters today, kudos to them, because everything seems to be segueing just perfectly one into another. Linda mentioned the Green Municipal Fund that is administered by the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, and from that very organization and program, we have Patrick Costigan, who is the manager of programs outreach. And Patrick, I will turn it over to you as our last speaker.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you very much for all being here today. Point taken, Linda, on the application process. Perfectly correct. We are actually working on streamlining the processes as we move forward to make it simpler for smaller communities to be able to access our funding. It's a big part of what we need to do going forward. So point taken, and it is something that we are very conscious of, and we're certainly working to improve as we move forward. So my name is Patrick Koski. I'm a manager here at Programs Outreach at FCM. And I'll be going over some of the funding offers that exist in terms of what we can do in terms of supporting municipalities in Canada and their partners to achieve their climate goals, green projects, as well as we move forward. So just a quick overview. The Green Municipal Fund is a $1.6 billion program funded by the federal government that is delivered by the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. It's now 22 years old, this is the Green Municipal Fund, and over that time, we've funded over 1,900 projects for over $1.2 billion worth of approved projects. And as you can see on the screen here, we also have been able to avoid 2.8 million tons of greenhouse gases through the projects we have funded. So our projects and our funding is available to all communities, whether you're 141 people or the City of Toronto. We can fund projects in your community, and we'll work hard to support you in those processes. So historically, what we've funded over the last 22 years is basically in 5 sectors. So the land use sector, transportation sector, water sector, waste sector, and energy sector. And I'll get into what exactly that means in a few minutes as well, in terms of the details of that. What we fund within these sectors are plans, studies, and pilot projects. And that is a straight grant for communities to have access to certain funding. So for plans and studies, for example, in all of these sectors, we can fund up to $175,000 for 50% of the eligible costs for the projects in the 5 sectors that you see here on the screen. For pilot projects, it's a grant up to $500,000 that will vary between 50 and 80% of the eligible cost, depending on the size of the community. So a smaller community of under 10, 20,000 people will be able to access 80% of the eligible project costs for a pilot project. A pilot project, from our perspective, is a project that is innovative, that can be replicated either in your community at a larger scale or in other communities at a larger scale as well. And so we're really looking for innovation in terms of pilot projects that we can fund. And finally, we fund projects that are capital projects. So the actually implementation of your project at the end of the process through loans and grants. So the way it basically works for that program is for all of these sectors is that you're getting a 15% amount of your loan amount is in grant form. So if you're getting a loan of $1 million, for example, you're getting $150,000 as a grant to go with it. That is the big advantage of coming through FCM for funding. The combination of grants and loans for the capital project is something obviously that is beneficial compared to going directly through a financial institution, which of course will not provide you a grant. And in different programs, that percentage, instead of being 15%, could be 25%, depending on the different programs we're looking at. So at a high level, what is it that we fund? We fund energy projects. So in municipalities in Canada that they're looking at, if you're looking at doing a new construction, either a fire hall or community center or public library or something of that nature, and you're looking to have a building to be net zero, that's the type of project that we can fund from a new construction perspective. Retrofit of municipal facilities, noting here, excluding community buildings, because that's in a new program that we've launched a couple of years ago. I'll get to that in a moment. So retrofitting of municipal facilities, we're looking at administrative buildings, fire halls, city halls. So basically buildings that are used more from an administrative perspective. Those are the buildings that we can work on, and we're looking for 30% energy efficiency for those projects. We also do energy recovery and district energy projects as well within the energy sector. And next we have transportation. So the main thing that we do here is fleet electrification. So if you're looking at electrifying your fleet and going to electric, we can fund you all the way from a plan to eventually a capital project. We also look for transportation networks and community options as well. So we're working right now, for example, to looking at funding an entire regional bus service that is going to go electric as we move forward. And we're looking at supporting that project. If you're looking at projects for bike paths, for example, that will reduce the use of cars in your communities and we have get more people to be using their bikes to commute from point A to point B. These are the type of things that we can fund through our transportation stream. From a waste perspective, which is the next one, is waste diversion. So trying to basically avoid what goes into the landfill. So any project that will help increase your diversion rate, either to 60% or over 60% of where it is today, these are the type of projects that we can fund. And we can also work on tackling circular economy projects within waste, looking at a specific stream that is problematic in your community, whether it's plastic, whether it's construction waste or whatnot. We can fund plan studies and capital projects in these sectors as well. On a water perspective, the two main ones that we've been funding over the last few years have been wastewater systems. So either the construction of new wastewater facilities or the upgrades of existing wastewater facilities to make sure that the wastewater is treated better, basically, and more efficiently, less energy used to do it as well. And of course, preserving some of the lakes and rivers that are connected or very often are directly connected to some of those waste facilities as well. Also, from a land use perspective, we also do, for water, we also do stormwater management as well. So if you're having a lot of flooding in your community and whatnot, and as a result, you're having a lot of overflow into your water system, we can support projects that can alleviate that a little bit as we move forward. And obviously a bigger challenge as we have more and more climate change incidences over the last couple of years. Land use, so we're looking at projects for site remediation, renewable energy production on a brownfield. So this is a stream that we don't fund as much of anymore, but we're looking for projects where once you remediate a brownfield, there'll be something energy efficient on top of it, basically. So we're not really just going to do a remediation without a plan afterwards. What we will fund is projects that are looking at remediating a brownfield with a very specific plan of having an energy production or energy building on top of the brownfield once it is remediated. So that's from a landfill perspective. So this is what we've been doing for the last 22 years. These are the main elements that we've been covering. A couple of years ago, in 2019, in the federal budget, we got $950 million from the federal government to look at 3 specific programs to, from an energy perspective, again, to support the climate goals of different communities as well in the country. So the first one is community efficiency financing, which also CEF, which is a program that is specifically connected to getting homeowners to do retrofits on their building through lending through the municipality or through a third party, like a credit union or a bank, and supporting the retrofits on people's homes. And the amounts that are loaned to the residents is basically paid back through property tax, for example. So that is the traditional way of doing it. It's a really good program, and it's getting a lot of buy-in because a lot of communities have old stock of housing that needs to be refurbished and retrofitted. Next is the Sustainable Affordable Housing Program, which is a program that our manager from that program, Jen Artfield, did a presentation on yesterday. I hope you could attend that session as well. And that's basically supporting housing providers and whatnot to apply for funding to either retrofit existing affordable housing or to build new affordable housing as well. And of course, there's more to this than in terms of criteria, but we can touch base on that in questions if need be as well. And finally, there's the community building retrofit program, which is basically retrofitting of community centers, town hall, community centers, libraries, arenas, and whatnot, getting these buildings to net zero over time, or at the minimum a 30% GHG reduction compared to the current baseline. So that's a program that was launched a couple of years ago as well. And every community in Canada years ago, from an arena to a library or community center or whatnot, that could use a bit of care in terms of getting it to more energy efficient and whatnot. So that's where that program comes in. So at the end of the day, all of these elements that we've covered are about 8 or 9 hours of presentation normally, covered in 5 minutes here today. So what I would invite you to do is feel free to reach out to us at the information that's indicated on the site, gmfinfo@fcm.ca, for an email or phone number as well. And if you're a municipality on this call, feel free to join our newsletter for the latest update on what we can fund. Anytime there's new programming or whatnot, you have the information there as well. And of course, we'd be glad to support you in your projects as we move forward. So thank you very much for the time. Thanks for the invitation. Once again, I'm looking forward to any questions. Thank you.
Patrick, thank you so much. And we're running just about on time here. We now can move into the Q&A discussion. Only 1 minute late, which is to the credit of all of our speakers, more than myself. So just a couple of quick notes here that. Sorry, I muted myself. I did get a note from Angel that he is just in the midst of having to do some travel. So so he's trying to multitask and still participate for the last portion of this session. That was a good sort of way to wrap up. It certainly is a Canadian centric sort of a program, but I think that what it does is it highlights some of the potential in some of these what I'll call connector layers in addressing the climate financing needs and approaches and changes that we have to see, that these connector layers are absolutely vital, and not only vital, but at times quite successful. In the case of the Green Municipal Fund here in Canada, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, Patrick, how many representative municipalities are members of FCM? Do you know the number offhand, or even roughly?
Yeah, absolutely. It's around 2,000 municipalities, which is about 91% of the Canadian population, are members of the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. That being said, you don't actually have to be a member to apply for funding. So any municipality, whether they're members or not, can apply for funding. That being said, we encourage you to be a member, of course, but you don't need to be to actually get access or funding.
Great. Yeah. So I mean, I think that's just a great, and just maybe one follow-up question, because I had a note that just as the slides were flying by there, I missed one point that I wanted to get down. The number of dollars dispersed through the Green Municipal Fund total. What was that number? It was in your second slide, I think.
So that they go back to the amount here. It's basically over $1.2 billion the projects over the years.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, really a great example of the way that these connector layers can provide a valuable linkage role between, especially between municipalities that, as Linda pointed out, oftentimes municipalities that sometimes have capacity issues. There is the desire, there is the identified need to address climate change and to change how we spend and what we spend on, but sometimes the capacity is one of the challenges. So I certainly think there's an important message here in what can we do to build up some of those connector layers in our developing countries and the neighbors that around the world, and especially in the global south, that there may be opportunities to build some of those connector layers to help the smaller municipalities in their efforts for that just climate transition, where capacity and technical knowledge, as was mentioned by Angel, is sometimes in a bit of a short supply. So I'm going to move on now to some of our attendee questions, and I did have a couple here that I just wanted to make sure I got from the notes, and so how about this? I'll go back to my notes in a moment here, but I will go to, I see that Kunal has his hand up, and I believe you're able to unmute yourself, but if,
Hi there, thank you very much. I'll be
yeah, so
as quick as possible. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Can.
Well, thank you all panel speakers for your great discussions on climate financing. I want to make one comment, and I have two brief questions for Eski and for Sonia. So thank you, Linda, for discussing about municipal financing. It's very relevant with the work I've been doing. As being an advisor to you, I've been working as a consultant on a number of government and ESG projects. In fact, I'm based in Australia, and I just finished helping out release a
We'll turn to Eski if there's an answer for that one.
Yeah, sure. I think that's a great question. So just one thing, let's step back in terms of CIV's implementation model. So we
Yes.
don't really directly work with governments. So we work through our multilateral development banks, and they implement, and they are in the business. Give you a couple of examples. World Bank, for instance, recently it launched green bonds, sustainability bonds. So our MDBs are becoming more and more kind of welcoming use of these instruments. I know in Inter-American Development Bank, they also have their own set of bonds. So again, this is something that our multilateral development bank partners are kind of pushing forward in addressing climate change.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for discussing that. That sounds very promising at this.
And I will share
some
links in the chat if you're interested.
That'd be great, please. Thank you.
We'll
We'll be in touch on that too.
Thank you.
Thank you. So my second question is for Sonia. So Sonia, given that you mentioned briefly on like impact assessments, I know there are a number of impact assessments out there on measuring like these climate financing initiatives, particularly on social and environmental matrices. And I know the Global Impact Investing Network has devised the IRIS framework, but do you have any other frameworks in mind that would be quite viable for effectively assessing these outcomes?
Yeah, so there's many different ways of doing this. For instance, there's the Sendai framework for disasters, which looks at disaster risks and implement issues. The Standing Committee on Finance for the UNFCCC last few years did a pretty comprehensive look where they looked across countries, submitted reports for what they thought they needed. There's different frameworks that are being used to do this. It really is the question of which one is appropriate to the space. And then there's especially when you're looking at serious loss, and I see in the chat, someone has got some question about glaciers and human rights for housing. That's when you're getting into the most difficult things to cost in the traditional models. Most of the traditional economic models don't cost those things very well. And so that's where you need to turn to more academic work where people are doing more creative ways of costing those. And there's a whole bunch of work also happening from those people who have done work in things like, displacements or very serious forms of loss where they've tried to measure those things as well. So you have to get more creative as you go upstream in terms of the kinds of losses that are being talked about. This is one of the issues that's going to become really big right now as loss and damage is becoming a bigger conversation because the assessment, actually one of the reasons I'm in India right now is we're trying to figure out some different ways of looking at assessment because they're not really fit for purpose. They miss out a lot of the really serious losses.
Thank you very much. I couldn't agree more.
Thank you. I think that may be a hand up. Is that Christopher Baines? Is that okay?
It is. I'm a newly elected councillor in Collingwood, and we were using these cards through Zoom. Yes, no, and request to speak. I'd like to follow up with a question with Sonia as well. I'm a newly elected councillor here in Collingwood, and this is overwhelming, if you will. And hats off to all of you for presenting really meat and potatoes solutions to these challenges we face here. But in that regard, Sonia, your example of the landlord who was loath to reinvest in the building by replacing the windows, etc. Have you guys down there, or does anyone here in the panel know any examples of a potential partnership between the three levels of government? In your case, I assume the state, the county, and the municipality, not to rebate cash to the landlord, but to allow credits for each of those levels, the taxes paid or the fees paid to each of those levels of government, such that the landlord would be incentivized to replace the windows and thereby see a reduction in the taxes paid. So it might be, perhaps it's too naive a solution, but a simpler, quicker way to try and get some movement on this file. Any thoughts on that?
I would turn this over to some of the folks who've done more direct municipal financing. So I'd be curious if the Federation of Canadian Municipalities have dealt with this issue at all. There have been attempts in a couple of other places to think about large grants for different kinds of housing. There were a group of states in the United States that tax certain kinds of energy credits. And that goes to community energy efficiency projects, which are specifically designed to target these missed opportunities. A number of other countries have come up with special grants that are specifically targeted at the landlord-renter problem. This is, there's lots of different ways of going about this. I don't know what's happening in Canada right now, so I don't know, maybe Patrick has a better sense of that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I can chime in very quickly. From the landlord renter issue, this is not an area of space for our funding, unfortunately, the Green Municipal Fund. What we do fund that is connected to retrofitting of housing is either through the SAW program, which is the Sustainable Vulnerable Housing Program. Of course, we're retrofitting of housing stock, as well as our community efficiency financing program, which is individual single dwelling residences that can get some funding as well, but they're not connected to the landlord specifically or the renter landlord potential issues in between both of them. It's really about the project itself and not about those issues outside of the process, but it's something we could consider as we move forward, but it's not currently part of our offer, unfortunately.
Thank you.
And I might jump in just briefly on this as well and say there's a couple of programs I'm aware of. One that I think is closest to what you're asking about. So City of Toronto offers discounted retrofit financing to multi-unit residential tower buildings, so through the tower renewal program. And so that's sort of one financing piece, but I think what I hear most often the first step is really around transparency and reporting. So you have programs like Rent Safe, which document kind of the condition of rental buildings across numerous metrics. And one potential metric for that kind of reporting is around energy efficiency. Obviously, in a housing market as tight as ours, where really any housing is good housing, it's maybe not as an effective an incentive. But certainly the idea that as a renter, I would be able to look at different options and say, oh, this one's going to be the cheapest for me if I'm paying my own utility bills. And by having that transparency around the energy efficiency of different rental stock, that starts to incent rental housing owners to be making those investments, because it aligns information and incentives together. And certainly there are municipalities that have introduced I guess, bylaws requiring energy reporting. And often that's the first step to then move towards energy benchmarking, where municipalities will actually start to say, we're kind of the same way some municipalities do for new construction, look to energy performance standards. There's also a movement towards asking for those same performance standards for existing building stock.
Thank you.
Thanks for that added info, Linda. And it does bring us back to one of the first notes that I made that came from Sonia's opening remarks. One of the biggest challenges that we have is the mismatching, the relationship between operating costs and capital costs. And as one of our speakers, I think it may have actually been you, Linda, where you reframed that municipalities have 50% of the control of decisions on climate, but we may need to reframe that as 50% of influence, but sometimes the controls that are exerted over municipalities make it difficult to apply that word control. And where we may be feeling the pressure to spend the capital costs on these changes, oftentimes we don't see all of the operating wins. We certainly see some on the, for instance, on the energy efficiency side. But when we look at things like the health costs, the health impacts through a greener, more carbon low community, oftentimes it's, in the case of the Canadian context, it's the provincial government that enjoys the health cost savings when we have healthier communities. So I think there needs to be certainly some further conversations about how do we take some of those savings and flow them down to our towns, our municipal levels, that if municipalities do take the initiative on the capital side, that some of that is funded through flow downs from upper levels of government that see the savings that maybe are not realized at the lower tier of government. I want to just move on to a couple of the other questions that I see. I saw one that was directed to Sonia, and you may have answered this in Kunal's question, but I just want to make sure. There was a question in the chat box to you, Sonia. Could you identify resources related to predictive modeling for budget development related to risk/costs in these uncertain times? I think maybe you had.
I just put an answer in there, but I can quickly tackle it.
Okay. Just popped up. Sure, go ahead.
You want. I wasn't sure if we were going to get to the ones in the chat, and it was a good question, Jenny, so I didn't want it to drop. Yeah, there's actually lots of different models you can do to do this, and there's lots of people out there trying different models to think about. For instance, you might look at several different scenarios, which are quite diverse. So one of the things we know about, if you're trying to just model, often the fallback is, well, we'll assume that the future is going to be like the past. But the thing about climate change is we really can't assume that the future is like the past. And so one of the things to do is to purposefully use very different scenarios that might happen and try to predict in these very different scenarios. A lot of this work is being done, but not that much of it happens at the municipal level. So there's some great work happening for whole countries. For instance, I was just at a talk today where, we were looking at 3 or 4 different, fundamentally different scenario models for the country of India and what it would mean for different kinds of finance implications. But that's at a whole country level. And it's not always happening at municipal level. This is an area where I would make a strong plug for those of you in the municipal level to be reaching out to local universities. Universities, especially the public universities, have a mandate to do publicly relevant work. And you have lots of people out there who actually want their work to be useful, but they don't know how to make the contacts. And so this is an area where reaching out to your local universities and trying to figure out who's doing energy modeling or economic predictions or climate costing and saying, hey, we have this issue. You might not get anywhere, but this is how we do a lot of work at Arizona State University. We have a coalition of cities, and every time they have an issue, they send it to us, and we're kind of like, who can take this issue? It's something I don't see as much in the Canadian context, and I'd really strongly encourage a tighter relationship, because some of this work is actually quite technically demanding, and you may not have the capacity in-house, especially for rural areas where it's really important. So you might as well make better, stronger connections with universities here.
Great point. And Sonia, if you are ever looking for a Canadian example, we are quite proud here at the City of Oshawa with our Teaching City Partnership, which is a partnership between the city, the Ontario Tech University, Durham College, so also a community college, Trent University's campus here in Oshawa, and also the Faculty of Engineering at University of Toronto, where we do exactly that. And it's something that we strongly urge other municipalities who have access to that sector to do as much as possible. We've been able to tackle some very interesting projects that are outside our area of technical expertise, and the post-secondary sector has been a wonderful partner for that. Just having a look back through the notes that I pulled out of some of the notes that are, there was a note, it wasn't a question, but the note from Joyce Hall mentioned that Ithaca is using a model that spreads out the costs of retrofitting by going large scale and bundling like buildings together. Really great advice on that one. We don't have to miss those opportunities where we could potentially scale the work across several buildings that may have similar retrofit needs. And then I'm just going to look back here to the, and for those who are here today, there are a number of links that are being provided in the chat that have been referenced in some of the comments from some of our panelists. Any other questions from the floor? I want to make sure that we don't miss any. We do have 10 minutes. Alex, I'll turn to you.
Thanks, Derek. And my apologies. I'm one of the organizers here, and I keep getting a pop-up on Zoom that says unstable connection, so I'll have to rectify that on break. But I do have a question for our colleague Patrick at FCM there, particularly around your comments on the Green Municipal Fund and pilot projects. Part of the Urban Economy Forum's work is what we call the World Urban Pavilion in Regent Park. It's a global knowledge exchange hub for sustainable urbanization and best practices. And part of this work is identifying pilot projects, of course, across the world, but also what we call made in Canada urban innovations and transformations for sustainable urban development. I'm curious about two things. One is, how is FCM, what is your process for disseminating some of the knowledge gained from these pilot projects, particularly around scaling and replicating? That's of particular interest for the World Urban Pavilion. And then the other question that is related is also how you're assessing the impact of these pilot projects, particularly around the economic, social, environmental, cultural, and governance.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of the impact, to answer your last question first, for all of the different streams that I talked about, we have very specific environmental benefits that need to be reached for us to be able to fund these projects. So that's the starting point. So for every category, there is very specific environmental impacts that we're looking for, actually environmental benefits, GHG reductions, or waste diversion percentages or whatnot. So we do have these very specific numbers that we're looking at. And projects that have the best chance of getting funding at FCM are the projects that not only have the environmental benefits, but also have the social benefits, the financial benefits for the community as well. So the triple bottom line effect, I think, is a big part of what we do. We are always looking for projects that will be able to basically check mark in all of these sections in order for us to be able to fund the projects. So that's from that's from that perspective. When we're looking at replicating and scaling up projects from a pilot project perspective, obviously we're looking for elements that fall into the boxes that I've identified here today. However, we do have something called signature projects, which is projects that are not exactly in the regular categories, but go beyond or do something a bit different that we normally don't fund, but still are innovative enough and can lead to potentially being replicated in other communities and whatnot. And we can consider projects of that in that category as well, depending on what you're trying to do. So what we would always say is if a municipality has a project that is that they're trying to pilot, or a community is trying to pilot either on a new funding model that they're trying to do to access funding for their communities for projects, or something really innovative on the technical front, we can have conversations with the communities about the projects and see if they fit anywhere in our current offer. And if they don't fit in our current offer, we're still willing to consider funding projects that do have a high potential replicability and can be scaled up as well, either in the community or at a larger scale. So we do certainly have openness to consider those type of projects as well. Hope that answers your question.
Awesome. Thanks, Patrick.
Thank you. Another note too, this just comes from the notes that I was making during the speaker's portion. There was a note made on green bonds issued by larger municipalities. Sometimes that is beyond the scope of smaller municipalities, again, just because of technical expertise and capacity. One of the things that I will note, however, is here in the region of Durham, which is the upper tier municipalities. So for those who are more familiar with counties, it's like a county, but maybe a little bit more of a complex government structure than a county. So the region of Durham is the upper tier municipality in the region that I'm in, and that my city is located in. Most of the smaller municipalities, or the lower tier municipalities in this region, when they are issuing bonds, and I'm not speaking just on green bonds, but in general, they actually historically have used the expertise of the upper tier municipality when they need to finance a project. It's actually the region of Durham that issues the bond. They have more of that technical expertise and capacity and experience. So certainly something I think to be considered is where are there opportunities for higher levels, whether it's counties or regions, to provide that expertise, and maybe where that's missing for things like green bonds. Is there a role for upper levels of government to be facilitators in, again, being that connector layer? There may be an opportunity for upper layers of government to assist in the structuring and issuance of those green bonds, where those, and we are talking about Habitat in Towns and the Collingwood project, which applies maybe to some of our smaller municipalities more so contextually. There may be an opportunity for some of those upper levels of government to assist in the structuring and issuance of bonds that might not be within the capacity. And then One other note that I'll mention here in the city of Oshawa, one of the things that we did just before my time, I was elected back in 2018, where there was the street lights in our city, all of the lights, and we're talking about not just hundreds but thousands, that were replaced with high efficiency LED lights to reduce the energy usage and make them more efficient. One of the ways that was financed was through an interfund note, and sometimes that's a tool that maybe we need to be exploring more. And I'll acknowledge that this may be something that is more applicable in developed countries where you have municipalities that have larger reserve funds, whether it's development charges sitting in reserves, et cetera. But that's a great tool to fund projects where you know that on the flip side, there is a savings to it. So you fund it through the savings over the 5 or the 10 years of that interfund note. And it means that in a moment of high pressure where you may have to retire that fund earlier, you're sort of the master of your own destiny in that case. If you need to retire it 2 or 3 years earlier than planned out of other funds, you have that opportunity, and there's no penalty from the bank. Sonia, you have your hand raised. I'll turn to you.
Yeah, I just wanted to raise one issue here when we're talking about sort of more creative funding at the municipal level. There was a study done in British Columbia a couple of years ago, maybe 2 years ago, that was looking at some of the more creative public-private partnerships that were being used to fund some green infrastructure. And it was a really disturbing study because it tracked the lack of capacity in the municipality. And they basically negotiated a terrible deal, which resulted in an enormous amount of public finance flowing to the private partners. And it was a real wake-up call because there's been a lot of conversation about using bonds or using public-private partnerships, creative finance, bringing in the private sector. But when we have municipalities with low capacity, these are complicated deals and you're locking in for possibly several generations. And it was just an area where it's something, for instance, I don't know what the Federation of Canadian Municipalities is thinking about this, or other entities thinking seriously about the capacity building on the finance end of municipalities, especially rural municipalities in Canada, who simply may not have the in-house capacity to deal with these kinds of deals in a smart way, because the potential to have a transfer of public finance out of the public sector is quite high. And so this is just a general, even in Canada, this is an issue we know about in other countries, but even in Canada, this is happening. And it's an area that I would just like to draw attention to as people are thinking about the kinds of long-term capacity that might need to get invested in to enable municipalities to deal with the kind of climate finance needs that are coming down the pipeline towards them.
Thank you, Sonia. That's an absolutely terrific point. And I think especially as we try to accelerate the climate finance needs. There was discussion earlier on that transfer to the global south, the great needs that are going to be there in financing for climate change, and potentially more vulnerable because of that, where they may get raw deals that are very much in the financier's interest, but might not be in the long-term interest of the community. So a very, very important red flag. I think we need to call it that because it is an important one. So thank you for raising that. I'm looking at the time and I'm seeing that it's 10:30, which is our wrap-up time. I know there is a 15-minute break, but I have been on site and in person at the Urban Economy Forum, the facility in Regent Park in Toronto, in person. And although it's a 15-minute break for those of us who just sort of sign off from our screen, for them it's a whole flow of motion between sessions. So I'm going to sign off just with one very quick comment. This comes back actually to a comment that Linda made from Grey County. She says she's often asked, how much will this cost? This might be a message to some of the politicians in the room, or who may be listening, or viewing this after. So this is maybe a comment for us. Certainly the question of how much will it cost? It's part of our job to ask that, but I think we also need to ask in the domain of political will for change. We need to not only ask how much will this cost, we need to ask also how much will it cost to not do this. It's a very, very important cost for political leaders across the globe, in both cities large and small, and in our towns. How much will it cost if we don't do it? So with that note, thank you so much to all of our participants. Such a rich discussion today. So much to take away. Again, I was taking many notes. I'm sure others will as well. Thank you to the participants, the attendees, and those who are listening online both now and in the future. Alex, I'll turn it over to you to wrap up.
Thank you so much, Derek. And with that, I encourage everyone to go back to the main room. We are going to show a short video. I'm very much excited for you all to join us for that. Thanks again, Derek.